A summary of the new or group theory from A New Theory of Human Evolution by Sir Arthur Keith. Let me begin this essay by recounting the circumstances which led me to formulate a new scheme of human evolution, to which I have given the provisional name of group theory. In 1908, when I had entered my 43rd year, I was placed in charge of the vast treasury of things housed in the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. Up to that time, I had occupied myself with an anatomical exploration of the bodies of man and ape, with a view to determining the structural relationship of the one to the other. Soon after taking office at the College of Surgeons, there was a shift in the main object of my inquiries. My chief interest became centered not in the structural resemblances and differences between man and ape, but in the problem of how the many species of ape, and in particular the various races of mankind, had come by the forms in which we now find them. In short, I found myself in pursuit of what, in crude terms, may be described as the machinery of human evolution. At the time of which I write, a fundamental addition was being made to our knowledge of the machinery of evolution by the discovery of substances to which Starling had given the name hormones. These substances, formed in the organs of the living body and circulating with the blood, served not only to harmonize the several functions of the body, but, as Starling inferred, to coordinate the development and growth of the organs and regions of the body, and so determine their form and features. To obtain a knowledge of the part played by hormones in the shaping of the human head and body, I applied myself to a close study of those disorders of growth which we had reason to believe were due to derangements of the hormone system, the Surgeons' Museum being particularly rich in examples of such disorders. I made a close study of the structural changes effected by an abnormal activity of the hormones emanating from the Pituitary Gland, as exemplified in the bodies of men and women who had become the subjects of that disorder of growth then known as acromegaly. I noted with interest that in the skulls of such subjects all the features which were overgrown were just those which found such a robust development in the fossil skulls of an extinct race, the Neanderthal race of Europe. It was therefore possible to explain many of the cranial features of Neanderthal man as being due to a vigorous action on the part of his pituitary system. From the study of the dead, I passed to that of the living. I came across families which manifested by their large frames and exaggerated features of face a dominance of their pituitaries. I noted, too, that such features often passed from parent to child. When I proceeded to speculate on how a new race could be fashioned out of such families, I came up against what, at first sight, seemed to be an insurmountable difficulty. These families married into other families, thus scattering abroad their genetic inheritance, their genes. Outside marriages brought fresh genes among them. A new race could be fashioned only if such families lived in a small, isolated community, inside which all marriages must be contracted. I therefore set out in search of such small, isolated communities in the modern world, and found that they were still in existence in those parts of the earth which are inhabited by primitive peoples. The evidence gleaned while on this inquiry into the groupings of primitive peoples convinced me that during the whole period of human evolution, mankind had been divided into a vast number of isolated local communities, each inhabiting a delimited area or territory. I made the results of this inquiry the subject of the address I gave to the Royal Anthropological Institute as its president at the close of 1915. My main thesis was that right down to the dawn of civilization, the habitable earth formed a mosaic of separated territories and of peoples, and that such a grouping favored rapid evolutionary change. Seeing that the apes, which show a structural affinity to man, are divided into local groups or communities, we may presume that the mosaic pattern was already in existence when the simian ancestry of man began to spread abroad on the earth. The area of distribution was extended by older, successful local groups giving off broods, which formed new groups or communities. The size of a local group depended on the natural fertility of its territory. In primitive peoples which still retain the original mosaic form, a local group varies from 50 to 150 individuals, men, women, and children. Such local, inbreeding, competitive groups I shall speak of as evolutionary units. They represent the original teams which were involved in the intergroup struggle for survival. I am assuming that the earliest forms of humanity were already organized on a mosaic pattern when the human brain reached the stage of development which made speech possible. Far from speech tending to break down the barriers between local groups, it had an opposite effect, for we know that speech changes quickly when primitive peoples become separated. Throughout the later stages of human evolution, the tendency has always been towards the production of larger and more powerful evolutionary units. In the continent of Australia, for example, where the native population has always been dependent on the natural produce of its territories, there remain only a few regions where local groups persist as separate evolutionary units. In the greater part of the continent, local groups have become federated into large, isolated, inbreeding evolutionary units, or tribes. Tribes represent a second step in the production of evolutionary units. In Africa, south of the Sahara, all stages of the growth of units are still to be found, from the local groups of Bushmen to large tribal federations, groups under chiefs or kings. The evidence from the New World corroborates that which has been cited from Africa. In pre-Spanish times, every stage in the development of evolutionary units was represented. In the extreme south, local groups still persisted among the Fuegians. In North America, among the Iroquois, for example, large tribal federations had come into being. In Mexico, and particularly in Peru, tribal groupings had almost reached a third stage, the national. The conversion of tribal evolutionary units into the still more powerful national units belongs to a late stage of human evolution. Indeed, national concentrations became possible only after agriculture and allied arts had made some degree of progress. When the written records of Europe begin, we find that continent divided into a multitude of tribal territories, many of which were of large size, and long before the end of the first millennium BC, the process of tribal fusion and federation had made considerable headway. I shall not stay now to discuss the feudal stage which intervened between the tribal and national stage in many parts of Europe. because the question which is uppermost in my mind is this: when does a tribal unit become a national unit? It is when tribesmen forget their former loyalties and become conscious of being sharers in and individual workers for the common destiny of their new or national unit. Thus, the group theory assumes that during the earlier stages of human evolution, nature's competing teams were represented by small local evolutionary units. Later, the local units became fused into larger or tribal units. By the fusion and disintegration of tribal units, national units came into existence. In a later essay, I shall discuss the effects which an increase in the size of a unit brings about in the rate of evolutionary change. Meantime, I may say that my main conclusion is that evolutionary change proceeds most quickly when the competing units are small in size and of great number. Such evidence as is afforded by the fossil remains of men who lived during the Pleistocene age, the latest of geological periods, the duration of which is estimated at 500,000 to 600,000 years, suggests rapid structural changes. At the beginning of that period, we find the poor-brained fossil men of Java and of China, while towards the end of that period, we can instance the rich-brained Cro-Magnon type of Europe. Many anthropologists hold the opinion that the original grouping of mankind was by kinship, and that it was only when such groups settled on the land that the demarcation became territorial. My inquiries of 1915 left me in no doubt that a territorial group was primary. Every one of the units I have specified, local communities, tribes, and nations, inhabited and claimed the sole ownership of a demarcated tract of country. All were bound to their homeland by a strong affection, and life was willingly sacrificed to maintain its integrity. I therefore came to regard the territorial sense, a conscious ownership of the homeland, one charged with deep emotion, as a highly important factor in human evolution. Every such territory serves as an evolutionary cradle. In assigning priority to kinship, authorities have been misled by the exceptional case of the children of Israel. They emerged from the desert, divided into 12 tribes, grouped according to kinship. Only after their arrival in Palestine did they become territorial. Among the great people of modern times, the only ones known to me who succeed in maintaining their identity without the aid of a territorial bond are the Jews. A sense of territory helps to keep primitive communities apart, and when we dig into human nature, we find a more potent machinery to secure the isolation of such communities. My gropings of 1915 led me to believe that the chief factor in securing isolation were a. clannishness, a mental state which impels us to favor our kind and to be indifferent or averse to all outside our kind, and b. the state of mind which Giddens had named the consciousness of kind. It is the latter factor that I would now emphasize, only I would speak not of consciousness of kind, but of consciousness of community. Among primitive peoples, the range of sympathy is confined to their own community. Local communities are primary social units. Being small, every face in them was known to members, strangers being immediately detected and their presence resented. This consciousness of kind, this community sense, is a character not only of human social groups, but of all animal societies whatsoever, be they ant or be they ape. On the other hand, a knowledge of blood relationship has been attained by man only, and could not have been reached until the human brain began to manifest its high faculties. The group theory assumes that the social organization and mentality still displayed by primitive peoples were those which regulated the conduct of evolving groups of humanity in past geological ages. If this assumption is permitted, then we can give a reasonable explanation of how human races arose. If it is rejected, then we can neither explain the origin of humanity as it now is, nor can we understand the strange duality of man's mentality. The process which secures the evolution of an isolated group of humanity is a combination of two principles which at first sight seem incompatible, namely cooperation with competition. So far as concerns the internal affairs of a local group, the warm emotional spirit of amity, sympathy, loyalty, and of mutual help prevails. But so far as concerns external affairs, its attitude towards surrounding groups, an opposite spirit is dominant, one of antagonism, of suspicion, distrust, contempt, or of open enmity. The spirit of cooperation helps to strengthen the social bonds of a group. The spirit of antagonism not only secures the isolation of the group, but compels it to maintain its power of defense and, if the group is to expand its dominion, its powers of offense. In brief, I hold that from the very beginning of human evolution, the conduct of every local group was regulated by two codes of morality, distinguished by Herbert Spencer as the code of amity and the code of enmity. They were thus exposed to natural selection two opposing aspects of man's mental nature. The code of amity favored the growth and ripening of all those qualities of human nature which find universal approval, friendliness, goodwill, love, altruism, idealism, faith, hope, charity, humility, and self-sacrifice, all the Christian virtues. Under the code of enmity arose those qualities which are condemned by all civilized minds: emulation, envy, the competitive spirit, deceit, intrigue, hate, anger, ferocity, and enmity. How the neural basis of such qualities, both good and bad, came into existence during the progressive development of the human brain, we do not know, but it is clear that the chances of survival of a struggling, evolving group would be strengthened by both sets of qualities. These two sets of opposite qualities must be balanced to secure continuous progressive evolutionary changes. An overdevelopment of the elements which subserve the code of amity would make its group vulnerable to its enemies. An overgrowth of those which support the code of enmity would lead ultimately to the destruction of the group. It will thus be seen that I look on the duality of human nature as an essential part of the machinery of human evolution. It is the cornerstone of my Mosaic edifice. Human nature is both a product and a process. It has been built up as a product of man's evolution, but it has been developed so as to serve in the process of evolutionary change. Besides the qualities in human nature which directly subserve one or other of man's two codes of morality, there are others which are of equal service to either code and which work for the welfare of the evolutionary group. In the forefront, I would place the quality of will known as courage. Man can be courageous in ill-doing as wholeheartedly as in well-doing. There is the inborn love of self. and yet a readiness to sacrifice self in causes both good and bad. There is that form of mental hunger known as curiosity. Urged by this appetite, man discovers with equal zest things which kill and things which cure. There are the virtues of prudence and temperance, which may be made the playthings of either code. Man may use his gifts of reason and of imagination to further good or bad ends. Loyalty rules among thieves as well as among honest men. If a group is to prosper, there must be within it a desire for children and a love of them. A love of knowledge is also advantageous. All these mental qualities have survival values. A love of beauty may also minister to the survival of a group. The major obstacle to the acceptance of the group theory of human evolution is the belief, held by most of my contemporaries, that from the very beginning mankind has been always on the move, jostling against and mixing with one another, and that there has been no long quiescent period when local groups were stationary, such being an essential postulate of my theory. The belief that man has always been a migratory animal is based upon the happenings of a comparatively recent period of human history. Dawn in history reveals vast movements of peoples in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the New World, and in the islands of the Pacific. It is inferred that these movements of historical times were but a continuation of the movements of the earliest prehistoric period. I regard this view as a mistaken one for two reasons. My first reason, a minor one, is based on the conditions under which our Pleistocene ancestors had to live. They were dependent on the natural product of their territories. To gain a bare livelihood was a daily preoccupation. Lack of supplies made long-range migratory movements impossible. Incursions into neighboring territories could have been of the nature of only local forays. It was only after domestication of animals and of plants had made some advance that there were sufficient stocks of food to make long-range and extensive migratory movements possible. My chief reason for disbelieving in early migratory movements is this. We have to account for the fact that each major racial type of mankind is confined to a single area of the globe. The Negro type to Africa, the Mongol type to Eastern Asia, the Caucasian type to Western Asia and Europe, the Australoid type to Australia and neighboring islands. If the group theory is accepted, then we can explain such a distribution. A long period in which local groups were comparatively stationary would bring about such a distribution. If there had been, as has been maintained by distinguished authorities, free migration and mixture in the human world from primordial times, then such distribution of types cannot be explained. In this preliminary essay, I have enumerated the chief points which make up my conception of the mode of man's evolution. To this conception, I have ventured with some degree of temerity to give the name group theory. In the essays which make up the remainder of this book, evidence in support of my thesis will be brought forward and discussed.